His legs wrapped around the man's waist and his hands got to work on the air hose. Riordan went down under the impact. He snarled tigerishly and fastened his hands on the Martian's narrow throat. Kreega snapped futilely at him with his beak. They rolled over in a cloud of dust. The brush began to chatter excitedly. Riordan tried to break Kreega's neck. The Martian twisted away, bored in again. With a shock of horror, the man heard the hiss of escaping air as Kreega's beak and fingers finally worried the air hose loose. An automatic valve clamped shut, but there was no connection with the pump now. Riordan cursed and got his hands about the Martian's throat again. Then he simply lay there, squeezing, and not all Kreega's writhing and twisting could break that grip. Riordan smiled sleepily and held his hands in place. After 5 minutes or so, Kreega was still. Riordan kept right on throttling him for another 5 minutes, just to make sure. Then he let go and fumbled at his back, trying to reach the pump. The air in his suit was hot and foul. He couldn't quite reach around to connect the hose to the pump. Poor design, he thought vaguely. But then, these airsuits weren't meant for battle armor. He looked at the slight, silent form of the Martian. A faint breeze ruffled the gray feathers. What a fighter the little guy had been. He'd be the pride of the trophy room back on Earth. Let's see now. He unrolled his sleeping bag and spread it carefully out. He'd never make it to the rocket with what air he had, so it was necessary to let the suspensine into his suit. But he'd have to get into the bag, lest the nights freeze his blood solid. He crawled in, fastening the flaps carefully, and opened the valve on the suspensine tank. Luckily he had it, but then a good hunter thinks of everything. He'd get awfully bored lying here till Wisby caught the signal in 10 days or so and came to find him, but he'd last. It would be an experience to remember. In this dry air, the Martian's skin would keep perfectly well. He felt the paralysis creep up on him, the waning of heartbeat and lung action. His senses and mind were still alive, and he grew aware that complete relaxation has its unpleasant aspects. Oh well, he'd won. He'd killed the wiliest game with his own hands. Presently Kreega sat up. He felt himself gingerly. There seemed to be a rib broken. Well, that could be fixed. He was still alive. He'd been choked for a good 10 minutes, but a Martian can last 15 without air. He opened the sleeping bag and got Riordan's keys. Then he limped slowly back to the rocket. A day or two of experimentation taught him how to fly it. He'd go to his kinsmen near Syrtis, now that they had an Earthly machine and Earthly weapons to copy. But there was another business first. He didn't hate Riordan, but Mars is a hard world. He went back and dragged the Earthling into a cave and hid him beyond all possibility of human search parties finding him. For a while he looked into the man's eyes. Horror stared dumbly back at him. He spoke slowly, in halting English. "For those you killed, and for being a stranger on a world that does not want you, and against the day when Mars is free, I leave you." Before departing, he got several oxygen tanks from the boat and hooked them into the man's air supply. That was quite a bit of air for one in suspended animation. Enough to keep him alive for 1,000 years. End of Duel on Syrtis by Powell Anderson.